Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the conclusion of a fascinating panel discussion on the future of the U.S. industrial base. And we have with us the man who is looking at the future of the United States industrial base, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy, Eric Chewning. Boy, that's a mouthful.
It is. Hey, Vago, how you doing?
It's great to see you, and this is your first interview since taking office, and we really appreciate it. You were a partner at McKinsey. You were a banker on the street, former U.S. Army veteran, combat veteran in Iraq. So you're bringing a lot of skills to this job. Early in the conversation when it started, you made clear of sort of the 5 big challenges, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the challenges, but also what are your priorities in this job at a very interesting time, working for an administration that's made America first, while your charge is overseeing a global industrial base on which the Pentagon depends.
Well, thanks, Vago. So essentially 2 things. One, with respect to America First and kind of the global defense industrial base, as you know, the Secretary's got 3 priorities, one of which is enhancing our partnerships and building new alliances. So I'm very confident that we'll be able to square this idea around how do we take a global industrial base into the 21st century. Your first question around the broader set of priorities for us going forward, I think it's very important that we frame the defense industrial base questions very broadly and look at it holistically. And for me, that really comes down to 5 systemic causes of risk for the industrial base. The first is the one that we extensively we're here to talk about today. How is sort of sequester and BCA driving risk in the industrial base? That's a very important question, but I think in and of itself is insufficient for explaining the challenges we have. The second risk type that I think we need to talk about more broadly is the role of competitors' industrial-based policies and how competitor nations are having an effect on our national security innovation base, and what do we need to do to counter that. The third is the general decline of the U.S. manufacturing base. That's occurred for a variety of reasons, but as you know, the defense industrial base is rooted in our general manufacturing base. What can we do to preserve that? Fourth, how are we thinking about workforce and skill challenges, both in STEMs as well as the trades? And fifth, DoD buying practices. What do we need to do to potentially be a better buyer? How are we doing business reform within the department?
You mentioned the Budget Control Act and the challenges that that's presented. What we heard today was Andrew Hunter and the CSIS team drafted a report looking at all tiers of the industrial base, looking at the Budget Control Act and its impact. That was in partnership with the Aerospace Industries Association. You two are doing your own assessment, just like the last administration did, the S2, T2 assessment of sort of looking at all the tiers of the industrial base. How do you project the health of the defense industrial base right now? And are there any findings that, are there any actions that you're going to have to take, policy actions, because of concern about some of these smaller tier suppliers and whether they're going to be there for the department?
Yeah, listen, there's definitely a need to take action with the industrial base. And I think it's important as we talk about, though, to come back to the 5 systemic risk causes and come up with policy recommendations, whether they're things the department does or legislative fixes that address those 5 systematic causes holistically, as well as how the risks that they've driven manifest themselves within our industrial base. And so what I want to make sure we do is don't focus on how do we find that one business that has, essentially everything with the industrial base tiers down to, and if that goes out of business, then we're in trouble. It's an important question, but I think if we just focus on that, we're missing the broader point. You're going to essentially miss, the forest and the trees. What are we doing to systematically increase the health of our defense and ecosystem across the board?
And what are some things you can do? What are some things you can do at this point that you're looking at to say, okay, here are some first steps that we can take in order to shore up the overall defense industrial base?
Yeah, well, I think a real good example of that is CFIUS modernization, actually, right? And so if you think about my second concern point around the industrial policy of competitor nations, right, I'll actually be on Thursday testifying on behalf of FIRMA. I think that's a near-term action we need to take to help shore up kind of the innovation pillars within our broader economy. Also, too, there's a bit of tactical things within our industrial base that we know need to fix. Our office has authorities, whether it's DPA Title III or IBAS, that we can use to sort of prop up shortfalls within the industry. And I think making that very active and making sure we're reaching out and communicating that those things are there. The broader structural changes are going to be working through themselves through policy and legislation that we're currently working on as part of the EO.
As part of the bigger review that you're doing that's due to the president, let me just parenthetically ask you a quick question. It's we're in a shutdown, or at least as we tape this, we're in a shutdown. Are there any actions, because your office does have broad and rather extraordinary powers on industrial prioritization and all of that stuff, are you doing anything on your docket, any actions that you're planning on taking?
Right now, listen, don't want to speculate about what the long-term implications are. As Secretary Mattis said over the weekend, the Department of Defense is going to continue to do its fundamental mission of protecting the American people.
In April, you will have a report that the administration will release its industrial strategy. As you mentioned before, it's America first, buy America, build America is important to the president. That has a lot of our allies a little bit concerned around the world that the United States may start to move away from what has been its sort of global approach to technology. A couple of years, we've had European companies that have made tremendous inroads here with very good product that scratched a Pentagon itch. As you go through that process, how do you square that circle? You said that you would try to square that. And is the department going to decide at some point, I'm going to err for an American product, even if it might not be as good as an overseas product, just because it's a domestic product?
Again, I come back to the Secretary's priorities are, one of which is how we're building alliances and strengthening our partnerships. And so, and keep in mind too, from my own operational experience as a soldier in Iraq, very mindful of the fact that MRAT technology didn't originate here and we had to source it from our partners. And so what I would caution folks against is over-reading into the idea that, listen, we're preparing ourselves for strategic long-term competition and informing that then drives how we think about all international trade more globally as part of our defense industrial base.
Do you see any change in sort of the special relationship, the UK, Australia, that by treaty now we have with Australia and the UK to sort of consider them more as part of the American industrial base, just as we have with Canada? Do you see any change at all in that in this process, or do you see it, looking at another way, expanding some of these strategic relationships to other partner nations?
I mean, per the NDAA, we're currently working through our NTIB framework, right, which is how do we build sort of the national technical industrial base with the UK, Canada, and Australia.
One of the things that you said in the panel discussion was that you are going to have to source beyond the traditional defense formulation. Talk to us a little bit about what that means as you look into the future, because that was a panel discussion that had John Luddy from AIA on it, Frank Kendall, the former Undersecretary of Technology for former AT&L, Andrew Hunter from CSIS, and you were on that panel. What did that mean, that you're going to have to think beyond the traditional defense formulation?
Sure. Well, I think it came from the reference to the National Security Innovation Base, which was a term that first came out of the NSS and was also in the National Defense Strategy document that came out on Friday. And it's just a recognition that says, listen, what we consider our traditional defense industrial base is part of what we would call the broader National Security Innovation Base. But just also recognizing that, listen, innovations for our warfighters are going to come from a variety of different sectors across both kind of the U.S. economy and more globally. And with the particular respect to the innovations where we're going to source those from, we have to account for them, we have to protect them, and we have to think of them as part of the broader ecosystem when we're considering where we're going to get technologies.
Do you, how do you, we were talking about this just before we got started, and Frank Kendall sort of talked about this as well. Frank has always said that the bigger challenge is how the operator thinks differently about the technology so that the acquisition system is ahead of some of these nations that are developing technology. If you look at the National Defense Strategy, one of the things that it talks a lot, for example, is artificial intelligence, robotics, and autonomy. But if you look at it, those are the very things that China, for example, has invested as a nation in an organized fashion a lot of money on. Mm-hmm. So, in World War II, we were the arsenal of democracy because everything we did was within our shores. How do you strike this balance? How do you compete at a national level? Give us sort of a sense of the contours of how we begin to eat an elephant that's that large.
Yeah. I think particularly to the kind of the exchange Frank and I had, I think it's very important to recognize the push-pull dynamic involved in innovation. And again, from my own experience as a warfighter in Iraq in 2004, we deployed thinking the fight was going to be one thing, and it turned out to be that was when essentially the counterinsurgency effort really took the height. And I have a lot of respect for the innovative ability of our men and women in uniform to, when they're on the ground, figure out how things need to change. And so the way I kind of talked with Frank, I think it's a push-pull dynamic, right? Where essentially our warfighters need to think about innovative doctrine and how they can apply it, and then our national industrial base needs to think about how they can continue to provide technological advantage in support of what those innovations are.
And what about the final point? What's the macro point, macro philosophical foundations of this? We're living in a globalized world. Your phone, my iPhone, your iPhone were manufactured in China. Moving up the power curve very, very quickly. And as Frank said, that chart he used to have of all the things that China is fielding and what little we're fielding. How do you change this dynamic fundamentally to tilt it in our favor and in favor of our allies? What are some foundational principles you're considering at this point?
I think you have to start with what the objective is for us in the near term, which is how do we begin to repivot ourselves to retool the industrial base for great power competition.
Looking forward to this conversation, Eric. Thanks very much.
Sure.
Fair winds following seas. Thank you.
My pleasure.